Today's battle of the bands is the Beach Boys versus the Beatles. This is the ultimate showdown. These bands shaped the sound of a generation. But which one truly reigns supreme? We'll leave that up to you to put your opinions in the comments. Let's get on with it. The year's 1964, and the Beach Boys drop I Get Around on the music scene. This track isn't just about cruising California's beaches. The seemingly innocent lyrics about getting around town mask a deeper message of teenage freedom and resistance to authority. At this point, the Beach Boys were riding high on their clean-cut image and harmonies, but behind the scenes, tensions were brewing. Brian Wilson, the band's primary songwriter, was already feeling the strain of constant touring and the pressure to produce hit after hit. Here's a fun fact. The opening falsetto, round, round, get around, I get around, wasn't originally part of the song. It was added at the last minute when the band realized they needed a stronger hook. Also released in 1964, A Hard Day's Night burst onto the scene as both a hit single and the title track of the Beatles' first feature film. Some people hear brilliance, others just noise. But isn't that just like the Beatles? Always pushing boundaries, always dividing opinion. By this time, the Beatles were no longer just a band. They were a global phenomenon. Beatlemania was in full swing, and the Fab Four were being hailed as musical messiahs. But let's be real. They were also four young lads from Liverpool thrust into the spotlight, dealing with fame in ways that would shape, and in some cases, warp, their lives forever. Did you know that the phrase, "A Hard Day's Night," was actually coined by Ringo Starr? He used it to describe a particularly grueling day of filming, and John Lennon liked it so much that he turned it into a song. It just goes to show that even the drummer can contribute something valuable now and then. Fast forward to 1966, and we have the Beach Boys releasing what many consider their best work with Good Vibrations. Brian Wilson spent over 6 months and $50,000, equivalent to about $400,000 today, producing this track. I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the... Some called it genius, others called it self-indulgent madness. Maybe it was both. By this point, the Beach Boys were no longer just America's band. They were serious contenders for the title of the world's greatest. Brian Wilson had stopped touring to focus on creating increasingly complex studio arrangements. This decision led to growing tensions within the band, especially with Mike Love, who preferred their earlier, simpler sound. Here's something to blow your mind. Good Vibrations was recorded in 17 different sessions in 4 separate studios. Wilson recorded dozens of takes of each section, then spliced them together to create the final product. It was like assembling a jigsaw puzzle where all the pieces were constantly changing shape. Alright folks, it's time to chime in. We've covered 3 iconic songs that defined an era. Which one resonates with you the most? Did you ever see the Beach Boys or Beatles live? Share your memories in the comments below, and if you're too young to have been there, tell us which song you wish you could have experienced when it first hit the airwaves. Now, let's get back to it. In 1965, the Beatles released Yesterday, a song that would become one of the most covered in music history. But let's not kid ourselves. This was essentially a Paul McCartney solo track. The other Beatles weren't even on it. Some argue this marks the beginning of the end for the band's unity. Others say it's simply a beautiful song. Yesterday, all my troubles seem so... At this point, the Beatles were at the height of their powers, but cracks were beginning to show. The band was evolving, but not necessarily together. Here's a tidbit that might surprise you. Paul McCartney woke up one morning with the melody fully formed in his head. He was convinced he must have heard it somewhere before, and spent weeks asking people if they recognized it. Talk about a dream come true, literally. The Beach Boys answered back in 1966 with God Only Knows, a song that Paul McCartney himself has called his favorite song of all time. High praise from the competition. God only knows what I'd be without you. This track came from the album Pet Sounds, which was Brian Wilson's response to the Beatles' Rubber Soul. The rivalry between these bands was pushing both to new heights of creativity. Did you know that this is one of the first pop songs to use the word God in its title? It was considered risky at the time, with some radio stations reluctant to play it. Imagine that, controversy over the word God in a love song. Times have certainly changed, haven't they? Back to the Beatles. In 1965, with In My Life, a nostalgic ballad that showcases John Lennon's more introspective side. But here's the rub. Lennon and McCartney disagree on who wrote what in this song. Lennon claims he wrote everything except the middle 8, while McCartney says he wrote the entire melody. Who do you believe?
As I remember all my life.
By this time, the Beatles were moving away from their mop-top, yeah image and into more sophisticated territory. They were growing up, and their music was growing with them. But not everyone was happy about this change. Some fans longed for the simpler days of I Want to Hold Your Hand. Here's a fun fact that might settle the Lennon-McCartney debate. The distinctive piano solo in the middle of the song was actually played by their producer, George Martin. So maybe the real genius behind the Beatles was neither John nor Paul, but George, Martin that is. We're halfway through our musical journey and things are heating up. Are you Team Beatles or Team Beach Boys? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to tell us about your favorite memory associated with any of these songs. Let's jump back to 1966 with the Beach Boys' Wouldn't It Be Nice? On the surface, it's a sweet song about young love, but dig deeper and you'll find a poignant commentary on the frustrations of youth in a conservative society. By this point, the Beach Boys were at their creative peak, but internal tensions were reaching a boiling point. Brian Wilson's increasing reclusiveness and experimental approach to music were causing friction with the other band members. Here's something to ponder. The song features a 12-string guitar, but the Beach Boys didn't have a 12-string guitarist. Session musician Carol Kaye played the part on an electric bass with a capo on the 8th fret. Talk about thinking outside the box. Now, let's turn to the Beatles' A Day in the Life from 1967. This song is often hailed as their crowning achievement. The BBC banned it for the line, "I'd love to turn you on," which they saw as a drug reference, but was that the real reason? At this stage, the Beatles were no longer even pretending to be a cohesive unit. A Day in the Life is essentially two separate songs, one by John and one by Paul, stitched together. Here's a macabre little detail for you. The sustained piano chord at the end of the song lasts 42 seconds. John Lennon told the engineers to make it sound like the end of the world. Considering the tumultuous events of the late 60s, maybe he wasn't far off. In 1969, the Beach Boys released I Can Hear Music. But here's the kicker. It wasn't written by Brian Wilson. It was a cover of a Phil Spector song with Carl Wilson taking the lead. Was this a sign that the Beach Boys were running out of steam, or a brilliant reimagining of another artist's work? By this time, the Beach Boys were struggling to stay relevant in a rapidly changing musical landscape. Brian Wilson's involvement with the band was becoming increasingly sporadic, and they were having to adapt to his absence. Here's an ironic twist for you. Phil Spector, who wrote the original version of this song, was famous for his wall of sound production technique. The Beach Boys version, however, is notable for its relatively sparse arrangement. Sometimes less is really more. We're in the home stretch now, folks. We've covered some of the most iconic songs of the 60s, but we've barely scratched the surface. What other tracks do you think should have made the cut? Are there any deep cuts from either band that you think deserve more recognition? Share your picks in the comments, and let's get a real music debate going. Here Comes the Sun. The Beatles, 1969. As we near the end of our journey, let's bask in the glow of the Beatles' Here Comes the Sun from 1969. It's a song full of hope and optimism. which is ironic considering the Beatles were on the verge of breaking up when it was recorded. Was this George Harrison's attempt to lighten the mood, or a final bittersweet celebration before the inevitable end? By 1969, the Beatles were barely functioning as a band. John had Yoko, Paul was asserting more control, George was coming into his own as a songwriter, and Ringo was still Ringo. The sunny disposition of this song stands in stark contrast to the band's behind-the-scenes reality. Here's a bit of trivia that might surprise you. Despite being one of the Beatles' most popular songs, Here Comes the Sun was never released as a single in the UK or US. Sometimes the biggest hits are the ones that sneak up on you. Let's wrap it up with the Beach Boys' Do It Again from 1968. This song was a deliberate throwback to their earlier surf rock sound. The late 60s were a tough time for the Beach Boys, with changing musical tastes leaving them struggling to find their place. At this point, the Beach Boys were at a crossroads. Brian Wilson's influence was waning, and the band was trying to find a new direction. This song, co-written by Brian Wilson and Mike Love, was an attempt to bridge the gap between their past and future. But can you ever really go home again? Here's a little-known fact. The drum intro for this song was actually a slowed-down recording of someone hitting a telephone pole with a stick. Now, that's what I call innovative percussion. So there you have it, folks. 10 iconic songs from two of the greatest bands of the 60s. The Beach Boys and the Beatles pushed each other to new heights of creativity, but who comes out on top in this battle of the bands? Tell us your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to share this video with your friends, like it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future band battles.